By the spring of 1941, the Mediterranean had become a sapphire-colored chessboard, where the stakes were nothing less than the soul of the war. To the north, the swastika fluttered over the Acropolis, and the Greek mainland had buckled under the weight of the Wehrmacht's blitzkrieg. To the south lay the Suez Canal and the oil fields of the Middle East, the jugular vein of the British Empire. Between these two worlds sat Crete, a rugged mountainous spine of an island, a natural aircraft carrier that neither side could afford to ignore. For Winston Churchill, Crete was a fortress that had to be held at any cost, a bastion from which the Royal Air Force could strike the Romanian oil fields at Plosti. For Adolf Hitler, the island was a nuisance, a potential flank for the upcoming invasion of the Soviet Union. Yet the man who would truly shape the destiny of this island was not a politician, but a visionary of vertical envelopment. General Kurt Student. He envisioned a stroke of military genius that the world had never seen, an entire island taken from the sky. But beneath the surface of this grand ambition lay the first of many systemic failures that would turn the Aegean blue into a deep, bruised crimson. The German intelligence service, the Abwehr, committed a blunder of catastrophic proportions. They informed Student and his planners that the British forces on the island were shattered, demoralized, and numbered no more than 5,000 men. In reality, over 40,000 Allied troops, many of them hardened veterans of the Greek campaign, were waiting in the olive groves. Even more devastating was the unseen hand of the British intelligence machine. Through the miracle of Ultra, the British had cracked the German Enigma code. General Bernard Freyberg, the Victoria Cross recipient in command of the Cretan defenses, did not just suspect an invasion was coming. He had the German flight schedules, the drop zones, and the troop strength sitting on his desk. Days before the first Junkers Ju-52 roared over the horizon. The stage was set for a collision between German hubris and British foreknowledge, a battle that would defy every rule of conventional warfare. The Germans believed they were descending upon a defeated remnant. The British believed they were waiting in an ambush that could not fail. Neither side understood that the rugged terrain of Crete and the ferocious spirit of its people would render all their calculations obsolete. On the morning of May 20th, 1941, the silence of the Cretan dawn was shattered by a low, rhythmic thrumming that seemed to vibrate the very earth. Thousands of paratroopers, the elite Fallschirmjäger, sat in the cramped, corrugated iron bellies of their transport planes. They were the hunters of the sky, the green devils who had stunned Van Emel and the Low Countries. But as the bay doors opened and they tumbled into the Mediterranean air, they were entering a slaughterhouse. The German tactical doctrine for airborne drops, ARAS, was fundamentally flawed for an island like Crete. The paratroopers were dropped at dangerously low altitudes, often less than 400 feet, to minimize their time in the air. However, they were armed only with pistols and grenades during the descent. Their primary weapons, rifles, submachine guns, and MG-34 were dropped in separate canisters marked with colored parachutes. As the silk canopies bloomed over the Malami airfield and the prison valley, the New Zealanders and Australians below looked up and saw a sky filled with targets. The paratroopers were helpless. They dangled in their harnesses, swaying in the wind, as Bren guns and Lee Enfield rifles tore through the air. Many were dead before their boots ever touched the soil. Others landed only to find themselves pinned down in open fields, unable to reach the weapon canisters that were their only hope of survival. At Malines, the 1st Assault Regiment landed directly on top of the 22nd New Zealand Battalion. It was not a battle, it was a massacre. The German commander of the assault, General Eugen Meindl, was shot through the chest shortly after landing. Coordination vanished. Small pockets of paratroopers crawled through the scrub using their combat knives and pistols to defend themselves against an enemy that held every piece of high ground. The irony of the first day was that despite the horrific casualties, the German plan only survived because of a singular failure in British communication. Hill 107, the high ground overlooking the Malines airfield, was the key to the entire island. If the British held the hill, no German plane could land. If the Germans took it, they could funnel in the reinforcements they so desperately needed. As night fell on the first day, the German position was hopeless. Yet the British commander on the hill, Lieutenant Colonel Andrew, feared his unit was being cut off. He ordered a withdrawal in the dark, a move that would change the course of history. While the professional soldiers bled in the valleys, a second, more primal force was rising from the Cretan hills. The German High Command had expected the local population to be either indifferent or welcoming to their presence. They had no understanding of the Cretan character, a culture forged through centuries of resistance against Ottoman and Venetian rule. To the Cretans, the paratroopers were not soldiers. They were invaders falling from the heavens like a biblical plague. Old men in black headscarves emerged from their villages carrying antique muskets from the Balkan Wars. Women and children armed themselves with kitchen knives, pitchforks, and heavy stones. In the village of Castelli, a group of paratroopers was surrounded and wiped out by a mob of civilians who fought with a ferocity that shocked the Germans. This was not the clean, clinical war the Fallschirmjäger had been trained for. The result was a cycle of brutality that would leave a permanent scar on the island. The Germans, enraged by what they saw as illegal partisan warfare, began a series of reprisals that would become a dark hallmark of the occupation. Entire villages like Kandamari and Kandanos were leveled. Their male populations lined up against walls and executed. The unsung heroes of the Cretan resistance paid for their defiance in blood, but their intervention during the first critical 48 hours delayed German movements and provided the Allies with a window of opportunity they failed to seize. At sea, the tragedy took a different form. The Royal Navy, under Admiral Cunningham, moved to intercept the German seaborne reinforcements. They were successful in smashing the German flotillas of small wooden kayaks, sending thousands of German mountain troops to the bottom of the Aegean. But the cost was staggering. Without air cover, the British cruisers and destroyers were sitting ducks for the Luftwaffe's Stuka dive bombers. The HMS Kelly, commanded by Louis Mountbatten, was flipped like a tea by German bombs. The HMS Gloucester and HMS Fiji were hounded until they sank into the depths, their crews struggling in oil-slick waters while German planes strafed them. Cunningham's famous quote resonated through the Admiralty. "It takes the Navy 3 years to build a ship. It will take 300 years to rebuild a reputation." The Navy stayed to protect the Army, but the price of that loyalty was the backbone of the Mediterranean fleet. By the 5th day, the systemic failure of the British command became terminal. Despite the bravery of the rank-and-file soldiers, the lack of aggressive counterattacks allowed the Germans to turn Malines from a graveyard into a functional bridgehead. Junkers Ju-52s began landing in a continuous stream, sometimes landing on top of the wreckage of their predecessors. The elite mountain division, the Gebirgsjäger, began to pour onto the island. The battle shifted from a desperate defense of the airfields to a brutal grinding retreat across the White Mountains. The Allied forces, now outgunned and under constant aerial bombardment, began the long march toward the southern coast. This was the Crete crawl, a grueling trek through sun-scorched gorges and over jagged peaks. Men threw away their equipment, their boots disintegrated, and thirst became a more immediate enemy than the Germans. The destination was Sfakia, a tiny fishing village tucked beneath towering cliffs. Here, the Royal Navy would attempt a final desperate evacuation. It was a scene of controlled chaos. Thousands of men huddled in the caves and shadows of the cliffs, waiting for the dark of night when the destroyers would slip into the harbor. Many were left behind, including thousands of Australians and New Zealanders who formed the rear guard, sacrificing their freedom so their comrades could escape to Egypt. As the last ships pulled away, the silence returned to the Cretan mountains, broken only by the sound of German boots and the distant weeping of those left to face the occupation. The island had fallen, but it was a victory that felt like a defeat. The elite of the German Airborne had been decimated. Out of the 13,000 paratroopers sent into the fray, nearly 4,000 were dead, and thousands more were wounded. It was a casualty rate that horrified even the most hardened commanders in Berlin. Hitler, surveying the butcher's bill of Operation Mercury, turned to General Student and delivered a verdict that would echo through the rest of the war. He told him that the day of the parachute arm was over, that the surprise factor had been lost forever. The Fallschirmjäger would never again be used in a major strategic airborne operation. They would spend the rest of the war fighting as elite infantry on the ground, their specialized skills relegated to the history books. The historical irony of Crete is profound. The British about lost the island despite having every possible advantage: numbers, terrain, and the enemy's secret plans. They lost because of a failure of nerve at the highest levels of local command. The Germans won the island, but in doing so, they destroyed the very tool that had given them their greatest successes. Crete was the graveyard of the Fallschirmjäger, a Pyrrhic victory that saved the British from future airborne invasions in places like Malta or Cyprus. As we look back at the sun-drenched ruins and the quiet cemeteries of Malem and Suda Bay, the philosophical takeaway is one of tragic paradox. It is the story of how a brilliant tactical success can be a strategic catastrophe. It is the story of how common soldiers and simple villagers can hold a superpower at bay through sheer, unadulterated will. The ghosts of Crete remain, the young men who fell from the clouds and the old men who rose from the earth, locked forever in the memory of a battle that changed the nature of war itself. The shadows lengthen over the Chania coastline, and the wind whispers through the olive trees that once ran red. The war moved on, leaving Crete behind to endure years of brutal occupation and heroic resistance. But the lesson of May 1941 remains etched in the stone of the White Mountains. Great empires are often blinded by their own light, and the most carefully laid plans can be undone by the simple, stubborn courage of those who refuse to be conquered. The sky belongs to the birds again, but the earth of Crete will always remember the day the gods fell from the heavens.
500 birds with wings of iron gray sailing toward the sun to steal the day. Students dream a gamble in the blue, jumping to a hell that they never knew. No reserve to save them from the fall, just the jagged rocks and the rifle's call. The Abwehr lied, the maps were painted blind, leaving all the logic of the war behind. They didn't see the scythe, they didn't see the knife, they only saw the mission, not the cost of life. Oh, Crete, you rose to meet the falling steel, with kitchen blades and hearts of tempered zeal. The Fallschirmjäger broken on the vine, lost in the groves across the mountain line. A victory of ghosts, a bitter hollow prize, the day the eagle died beneath the Aegean skies. Hilton 07 stood in silent dread, a ghost retreat left the heights for dead. Then came the transport planes to kiss the fire, burning on the tarmac, a funeral pyre. The Stukas screamed, the cruisers met the grave, the cost of holding on, the price of being brave. The paratroopers' day, the legend turned to stone, the Führer's cold regret for the men he'd thrown. They left the airborne dream upon the sand, a broken sword, a blood-soaked barren land. Stand indifferent and cold, watching over stories that will never be told. No more the leap of faith, no more the sky, just the olive trees whispering along last sigh. The aging tide washes the pride away. Crete remains in the light.